Our next presenter today is Robert Fitrakis, a political science professor in the Social Sciences and Legal Studies Department at Columbus State Community College and co-founder of the Democratic Socialists of America. His presentation is titled "The Idea of Democratic Socialism and the Decline of the Socialist Party."
All right, 20 minutes to go over the idea of democratic socialism in America and the decline of the Socialist Party. And again, that is the independent third party known as the Socialist Party, which is very timely with the rise of Bernie Sanders. First of all, I'd like to point out sort of how the idea came about. Really, the American democratic socialist ideal has come forth through an apostolic succession of sorts, right? They had three great men in a row, and then sort of the vanishing of this, and far more decentralized in the movement of other women into the movement, like Barbara Ehrenreich into leadership. But Eugene Debs, which we just heard about, 1855 to 1926, Norman Thomas, 1884 to 1968, and Michael Harrington, 1928 to 1989. And I would argue that the idea of democratic socialism in America is very unique and indigenous. In part, I hate to say it, but it's sort of an American hybrid exceptionalism to sort of European concepts of socialism and stuff and ideas we'd find elsewhere in the world. So here's my assessment of democratic socialism in America. Here's what I believe the idea is about. First of all, it believes in both procedural and substantial democracy. That is, Debs, Thomas, and Harrington's definition of democratic socialism is the democratization of the means of production and distribution, right? I'm working on I'm reviewing a paper for the Journal of American Political Thought, and sadly, I'm reviewing a paper on Bernie Sanders, and it's filled with quotes on how you don't go for production and distribution, is that it's more of a mixed economy, and really you want to make the state do really good things. So when we assess Sanders, some of us, or in the future, it'll be interesting to see that he actually, while calling himself a democratic socialist, is far more likely to meet the definition of a social democrat, right? Or American progressive. Let's regulate the system. Let's make it work for everybody, but let's not go after, fundamental transformation in the means of production and distribution. Okay, so it's procedurally and substantially democratic. It ultimately, in that form, seeks to transcend capitalism, not to reform it. The beauty of Debs, it was, and this is part of the idea, is it was a moral crusade, right? You're pointing out the exploitive evils of capitalism. So Debs did that over and over again and how it led to war. But Norman Thomas, wrote a book in the 1930s called Human Exploitation. Right? What was the capitalist system? It was based on human exploitation. It wasn't to be reformed. It was to be transcended. It also manifests a certain anti-status impulse. American democratic socialism at its best, Debs was perhaps one of the most libertarian socialist leaders in history. He dreamed, right, of a small community of equals and neighbors and friends, right? He worked with the Wobblies. He was one with them. He wanted the government to be smaller. He didn't trust the oppressive nature of the government, and that makes perfect sense, does it not? Particularly after the Pullman strike, right, of 1894. So he felt that the government of the United States, the bigger it got, the more repressive it got. And Thomas writes a very famous letter to the Socialist Party saying, he's 33 years old and he's joining it because of World War I, and goes, undue exaltation of the state. I'm reluctant to join you because I fear you may be too statist. And again, co-founder of the ACLU was Norman Thomas. And some of you may know, of course, that Harrington was actually a Catholic anarchist and worked with Dorothy Day. And that prior to that, he was a libertarian believer in Robert Taft. So Harrington started out as both a libertarian and a Catholic anarchist before he fell under the sway of Max Shachtman, which we'll touch upon later, because of their significance really to the failure of the idea of democratic socialism in the United States and to neoconservatism. You could argue, and I will later, that that led in many ways to the decline of the idea as they entered the Democratic Party in 1960. So, the idea of democratic socialism in America is also an extension of earlier American peace and anti-imperialist legacy that you found in people like William Jennings Bryan. America is often credited with having the first kind of mass anti-imperialist movement really around the Spanish-American War in 1898 among modern nations. Other things. It also harbors, there's a deeply moral sentiment that you'll find in Debs and Thomas and Harrington, and also a deeply Christian, I think, in the best sense of that term, the Sermon on the Mount, not what happened in the 1920s when the corporate state, brought back the parable of the talents to create the capitalist Jesus. That's what in the United States, those of you who know that story, right, the corporate ideal emerges in the 20s, and they pushed the book, The Man Nobody Knew, and suddenly it was discovered in a bestseller that Jesus should be thought of as a CEO. And the 12 disciples as his board, but deliberate propaganda, because remember the words of Debs, right? To paraphrase Debs when he's in the Woodstock jail, and he hints that he may have been visited by the Holy Spirit, but he says, right, in the gleam of every bayonet and in the flash of every rifle, the class struggle was revealed. So there was... and you've got these stories of Debs. It's hard to believe now, but born-again Christians were very left-wing. Again, good books on this, on radicalism in the Southwest, is that there was a notion of the second coming of Christ and the revolution were one and the same. They both represented justice. So, again, well up until Richard Viguerie and Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority in the 1970s, evangelical born-again Christians were just as likely to vote Democratic as they were Republican. But Debs, wasn't quoting Marx. Debs, would be more likely to quote the Bible in that aspect. So he was, in many ways, the common culture at the time, just like today. If Debs was around, he'd be, maybe not using the term intersectionality, but he'd certainly be practicing as out in his day to immigrants. Some of my favorite stories about Debs, relation to that, one of them is he would appear before immigrant groups, Italians, Jewish immigrant groups, where virtually nobody could speak English. And at the ones, the New York Times would go there and go, "What's going on here?" And they ask the Italians, they go, "Oh yes, we don't know what he's saying, but he speaks from his heart through his hands." We know he loves us. We know he's with us. And in the Jewish halls, they would chant, "Debs, Debs, Debs." It's the same thing. You know he's on your side. Look, he's here. He's fighting with us. So ultimately, the idea of democratic socialism in America was a moral crusade. And I would argue that in part, under Michael Harrington, who I knew quite well and worked quite closely with, you saw the increased intellectualization of that idea. And it wasn't quite as grassroots. And while it was expressed often at the Socialist Scholars Conference, which kind of morphed into the left forum, is with the demographic shifts in society, I think the idea itself became less grassroots, as it was with Debs, a little less so with Thomas, and became far more ideas in journals like Dissent, etc. So, as we look, in terms of the Socialist Party, most of you know the Socialist Party reached its peak in terms of politics in 1912, right? It's founded in 1900. It's brought together. Debs had flirted, some of you may know this, but Debs had flirted with other ideas. His big idea was to turn Washington into a socialist commune. He actually wrote a letter to John D. Rockefeller saying, "Look, we'll leave you alone. We'll leave your country alone. Can you give us some money to take over Washington?" Okay. And of course, another great success locally during that period, and we'll talk about 1912 here in a second, but in 1915-16, when the Non-Partisan League, when the Socialist Party of North Dakota, with the help of Model Ts, were able to take over the government of North Dakota, elect the governor, elect the vast majority of people to the state legislature, and then create the State Bank of North Dakota, grain elevators, and other socialist practices that were quite successful, right? Up to the time of Ronald Reagan, the largest bank between the Mississippi and the West Coast was still the North Dakota State Bank. So Debs comes along in 1900. He's nominated as he is in 1904, 1908, 1912. 1908, of course, had the Red Special, right, as he's going around on a train. And he very much forecasting the future, because in 1908, if you read it closely, he's got the 1936 Democratic Party platform already spelled out, decades ahead of when it was adopted and watered down by Roosevelt. So 1912, again, reaches its peak. There's 120,000 dues-paying members of the Socialist Party. 120,000. 79 elected mayors. It, of course, was in Oklahoma, it was the second largest party. It was more members in the state legislature, 22 or so, than the Republican Party. And of course, the state where the most votes were cast, Ohio, which had 17 mayors in that period. And newspapers, county newspapers everywhere, Socialist Party papers. In Columbus, for example, 4 members of the city council, 4 out of the 21 were socialists. Thank God they changed that immediately after they were elected. to only 7 members elected at large. They had 3 socialists on the school board. You had this situation going on, so there was a tremendous backlash. In the northeastern United States, the 2 major parties in 1917 united over the war issue in the fall elections against the Socialists. The Socialists still got over a quarter of the vote in the country. So that's why more repressive means, of course, came forward, including in the aftermath, the first Red Scare. So Debs was able to build this mass-based party, 6% of the vote, 1 million votes or so, elected officials in 1912. What does it in? Well, a few things. The party itself ran Alan Benson, an anti-war journalist in 1916. Debs didn't feel up to running. Benson ran, and there was a decline, 30% decline in the vote. Then, of course, after we go to war, Benson switched sides and went over to Wilson. Also, some of the leading intellectuals of the day ended up, W.E.B. Du Bois, backing Wilson for president in 1916 because he kept us out of war, among other things. So by 1920, in the great act, of civil disobedience, he runs from president from jail. And of course, he sold those little statues. I assume you have some of those Debs busts from 1920 that, oh, right. But yeah, I mean, talk about a great fundraiser, right? The poster with his prison number and dressed in prison garb. One of the great campaigns, I would argue, in U.S. history over not only the idea of democratic socialism, but what were theoretically fundamental American values that were being trampled on, as they usually are in the United States. Moving away from Debs, of course, was replaced by Norman Thomas as the leader. Debs, in 1924, for the first time, embraced a third party that wasn't the Socialist Party. He embraced the Progressive Party of Bob La Follette. This caused great debate within the party itself because he said what he wanted was a united front from below of labor left forces. So this is only a few years before he died. Thomas comes forward. Thomas backed this idea, but then Thomas is nominated for the presidency in 1928, where he then runs 6 straight times for president of the United States. Gets 1 million votes in 1932, for example. The party splits, huge split. Social Democratic Federation goes off in 36 to back Roosevelt and the New Deal. So Thomas enters the 30s in the Great Depression and builds a fairly large party, 30,000 dues-paying members, able to get 1 million votes in 1932. But that all vanishes as he can't fight back the New Deal. So in 1940, there's an assessment where one commentator says it's just as likely the Socialist Party will come back as the Whigs will rise from their century-long grave. So there wasn't a whole lot of prospects in 1940, but Thomas runs in 40, he runs in 44, he runs in 48. And then in 52 and 56, Thomas doesn't run, a small amount of votes are obtained, but what happens to the idea itself, of course, is you have a situation where how many of you are familiar with the Shachtmanites? Right, okay, good. Probably the only people in America where half the audience would raise its hand. right? So, and their linear descents, PNAC, again, what's the Project for a New American Century, William Kristol, etc. The neocons who had so much sway beginning in the Reagan administration around Gene Kirkpatrick, and of course with the Clintons a bit later on, but particularly in the W administration, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, among others. Pearl, who ran Scoop Jackson's office there in Washington when I met him. Okay, so we're in a situation where in you've got a small group of break-offs, Trotskyists, the Trotskyists, of course, would call them renegade Trotskyists, that break off around the issue of bureaucratic collectivism, right? A notion that Marxist, Leninist nations are inherently more evil than corporate capitalist nations. Corporate capitalist nations can reform themselves. Marxist, Leninists can't reform their bureaucracies, their sclerotic bureaucracies. Hence, in that situation in 1960, they're coming up with ways to bring socialist values to the US, and they seize upon the realignment party, is that the Socialist Party should go into the Democratic Party and act as its left wing. Quote, as Harrington would say, the left wing of the possible, right? The Democratic left. So it goes in at a time in the 1960s, a decade where there's massive grassroots activists. Harrington finds himself at odds with the New Left, with the SDS, and working in the Johnson administration as the architect on the war on poverty, where he, of course, uses the term I'm stuck, where he had some mental health problems really over the war in Vietnam, which he thought was destroying the war on poverty. So the party goes forward in 68. There was plans the year, Thomas is near death, about to die, but there was talk of running King for president and Thomas for vice president. Harrington keeps arguing, no, we shouldn't run independent candidates. We should, in fact, run within the Democratic Party. So in 1973, after the 72 election, where the dominant elements of the Socialist Party, the Shachtmanites, backed Nixon for the last intellectual forces in America, backing Nixon for president, causes the party to split into three factions. The small factions among the great and recently deceased David McReynolds, right, kind of a pacifist wing that was very much closer to Thomas's tradition of pacifism and socialism. Of course, DSOC, Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and of course the Social Democrats USA, who Irving Howe, who went with Michael Harrington, called the Social Democrats CIA. They've brought us Freedom House. They worked with Kirkpatrick, and they have their own intelligence network throughout the world. So ultimately, I would argue that the idea of democratic socialism in America, which was uniquely based on moral crusades for social justice and to end economic and social exploitation of the least of our brothers and sisters, it died when it began to do lay work for liberals. And again, having been involved in many of those conversations, and of course, one time having been told why, as a DSA member, I couldn't be backed because there was a progressive I might take votes from. So it was very much a strategical approach. But now you've got, and the party reached 10,000 members at its height back in the Reagan years, then 6,000, but now an estimated 50,000 people, right? Bernie Sanders, who always was at odds with Michael Harrington, and they used to argue at the Socialist Scholars Conference because Bernie would always say, "Why don't you run somebody?" What do you mean you're not running people? Why don't you run Socialist? And so a lot of that debate never materialized. Michael was thinking about running in 1980. He was preparing a committee. I was working on that committee, and then Ted Kennedy got in the race. But my argument, if the idea of democratic socialism is going to go forward, it has to go forward in moral electoral crusades. That's what's at the crux of the idea. Thank you.